The Velvet Room was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel like they were touching something they shouldn't. That was the whole point, I supposed. Chandeliers dripped like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling, casting everything in a pale gold that felt more like a warning than a welcome. The leather booths were deep crimson, the bar top polished obsidian, and the music, some low, aching jazz, seemed to seep through the walls rather than play from any discernible speaker. It was a restaurant designed to make you forget you were mortal, designed to make you spend money you didn't have on food you couldn't pronounce, surrounded by men in suits that cost more than my monthly rent. I'd been working here for 8 months, and I still felt like a trespasser every single shift. My name is Sarah Calloway, 26 years old, former pre-law student turned full-time waitress when my mother's medical bills rewrote every plan I'd ever made for my life. I wore the Velvet Room uniform, black dress, low enough to be elegant, high enough to keep me employable, and I carried a notepad that I barely used because I'd learned to memorize orders. Tips were better when you looked like you were paying attention with your eyes rather than your pen. That night, the night everything cracked open, started like any other Friday. The kitchen was behind schedule. Table 7 had complained about their foie gras twice. My heels were punishing my arches. And Marcus, the floor manager, had already shot me 3 pointed looks that roughly translated to smile harder. Sarah, you're not paid to have feelings. I was refilling the water station near the East Corridor when I heard it. Not loud. Not dramatic. Not the kind of sound you'd expect to stop you in your tracks. Just breathing. Ragged, uneven, wrong. The East Corridor connected the private dining suites to the main floor, a narrow, dim passage that smelled of cedar and expensive candles. Guests weren't supposed to be there unaccompanied. Staff rarely used it after 9. I hesitated, told myself it was probably nothing. A drunk guest catching their bearings, someone on a phone call that had gone emotionally sideways. But the sound didn't stop. And something in me, the part that had sat beside hospital beds at 3 in the morning and learned to recognize the sound of a person quietly falling apart, moved before my logic could argue. I turned the corner. He was on the floor. That was the first thing that broke my understanding of the world, because men like this did not sit on floors. He was in a 3-piece suit the color of midnight, his jacket still perfectly buttoned, his shoes still mirror-shined, his cufflinks still catching the distant light like small cold stars. Everything about him was constructed for dominance. And yet he was on the floor, back pressed against the wall, one knee drawn up, his head tipped back with his eyes closed. Both hands were pressed flat against the marble, fingers splayed, like he was trying to anchor himself to the ground. His chest was heaving. He was tall. Even folded against that wall, I could see the architecture of someone who occupied space differently than the rest of us. Dark hair, sharp jaw shadowed with stubble, a face so precisely carved it looked like it had been made to intimidate from a distance and absolutely devastate up close. I didn't know who he was yet. I would learn soon enough. For one suspended, crystalline moment, I stood in the mouth of that corridor and watched a man who looked like he had never been powerless in his life completely lose his grip on his own breathing. I should have turned around. I should have gotten Marcus. I should have done exactly what my training dictated, which was to alert management and under no circumstances engage a guest in a private moment. I set my water pitcher down on the narrow shelf beside me. And I walked toward him. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask if he was okay. I could see that he wasn't. I didn't announce myself or apologize for the intrusion. I simply walked forward, lowered myself carefully to the floor beside him, and sat down. He flinched when he sensed me. His eyes opened, dark, nearly black, and for one fraction of a second, completely unguarded. I saw something raw pass through them. Something close to panic, and then something else. A sharp, instinctive threat response, like a wounded animal that doesn't yet know if you're friend or predator. I looked at him. I didn't speak. I just held his gaze and slowly extended my hand, palm up, open, the way you'd offer something without demanding anything in return. He stared at my hand for what felt like several long seconds. Then, without a word, he placed his hand in mine. His grip was firm, even now, even like this. His fingers closed around mine with a kind of desperate control, and I felt the tremor running through his hand, faint but unmistakable, the involuntary confession of a body that had pushed past its threshold. I didn't squeeze. I didn't rub circles. I didn't say it's okay or breathe or any of the things people say when they want to fill silence with usefulness. I just held on. And slowly, over the course of what might have been 3 minutes or 10, his breathing changed. The ragged edges smoothed. The heaving slowed. The tremor faded until his hand was simply large and warm and very still wrapped around mine. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel pulled from deep water. "Who are you?" I looked at him. This beautiful, dangerous stranger on the marble floor of a luxury restaurant corridor, and something in my chest shifted in a way I couldn't name and wouldn't be able to undo. "Nobody," I said softly. "Just a waitress." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind those dark eyes, something measuring and bewildered and almost painfully human. "Nobody," he repeated, very quietly, like he was filing it away. He didn't let go of my hand. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew, sitting on that cold marble floor with his hand holding mine, that my life had just divided itself into 2 distinct halves, everything before this moment and everything after. I found out who he was the next morning. Not from him. He'd been gone by the time I stood up from that corridor floor, his absence so complete it might have been a dream, except for the faint warmth still lingering in my palm. No goodbye. No explanation. Just an empty corridor and the distant sound of jazz that hadn't noticed anything had happened. I'd finished my shift in a quiet fog, changed out of my uniform and taken the 40-minute bus ride home to my apartment in the Carver district, the part of the city that the Velvet Room's clientele didn't know existed. I'd checked on my mother, reheated the soup she hadn't touched, and lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling while something unnamed turned circles in my chest. In the morning, I found out his name by accident. Elena, one of the other waitresses who'd worked the Velvet Room for 3 years and therefore considered herself its institutional memory, dropped a folded newspaper on the break room table beside my coffee and said, "Did you see who was here last night?" The paper was open to the business section. I didn't understand why at first. The business section didn't usually feature men who made my hands go cold. Then I saw the photograph. He was standing on the steps of what appeared to be a courthouse, flanked by 2 men in suits who scanned the crowd the way trained dogs scan for fire. He was in a different suit now, charcoal gray, but the face was the same. Same sharp jaw. Same dark eyes that appeared to be looking directly through whoever was pointing the camera. Same architecture of absolute authority that somehow still carried, in my memory, the phantom weight of a trembling hand. Lazaro Voss. Read the caption beneath. CEO, Voss Capital Holdings, seen leaving federal inquiry, 3rd consecutive year. Lazaro Voss, I said out loud, tasting the syllables like they might burn. Elena glanced at me. "You know who he is?" "No," I said. Which was the truth, technically. His family owns half the Port District, and by own I mean she lowered her voice with the practiced theatrics of someone who'd been waiting for a reason to say this. They've been tied to organized crime since his grandfather's time. The Voss Syndicate. They call him Il Direttore. The director. Nobody proves anything, because nobody who could prove anything keeps breathing long enough to testify. She said it the way people say things they want to be dramatic, with the assumption that it isn't quite real. I thought about a man sitting on a marble floor, unable to control his own breath. He was in the East Suite last night, I said carefully. Private dinner, I know. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Did you see him? Briefly, I said, refilling water. She looked at me for a moment like she was waiting for more, then shrugged and took her coffee. Just don't get noticed. Men like that, getting noticed is either the best or worst thing that can happen to you, and there's no way to know in advance which one it'll be. I stared at the newspaper photograph for a long time after she left. In the photo, Lazaro Voss was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who had never in his life been caught off guard. I thought about his hand shaking in mine. I thought about how he'd said nobody like it was the most significant word he'd encountered all evening. I served 4 tables that lunch shift and dropped nothing, which was a minor miracle, considering that every time the front door opened, my pulse staged a small uprising. He didn't come in. Of course he didn't come in. Men like Lazaro Voss didn't return to scenes of vulnerability. That was the whole logic of men like him. You didn't repeat the moment that exposed you. You moved forward. You buried it. You acted like the marble floor had never held you. I was halfway through resetting a table near the window when Marcus appeared at my elbow, his expression caught between professional smoothness and something I couldn't quite read. Sarah. His voice was calibrated to carry no information to anyone nearby. You've been requested. I turned slowly. Requested? Suite 4. He adjusted his cufflinks, a tell I'd learned meant he was uncomfortable. Mr. Voss has reserved the East Dining Suite for a private lunch. He asked specifically for you to be assigned. The room didn't change. The jazz didn't skip. The chandeliers continued their quiet, indifferent glowing. He asked specifically for you. I serve the main floor, I said. Delphine handles the suites. Delphine has been reassigned. Marcus's tone closed like a door. This isn't a request, Sarah, not from someone like him. I looked at the table I'd been resetting. A neat row of silverware, perfectly aligned. The kind of order you could control, the kind that stayed where you put it. Fine, I said. Suite 4 was at the end of the east corridor. I paused outside the door for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to tell myself I wasn't afraid, which was of course a lie. Then I pushed it open. He was already seated. He looked different in the daylight filtering through the suite's frosted windows. Harder, somehow, and more composed, every line of him assembled back into the version the newspaper had photographed, the version that stood outside courthouses looking through cameras. A single glass of water sat untouched in front of him. No menu. He didn't need one, I suspected. Men like him didn't ask for options. He looked up when I walked in. And the first thing he said, quiet, direct, carrying all the weight of a man who had spent the entire morning deciding exactly how he was going to say it, was, "You didn't tell anyone." It wasn't a question. No, I said. He studied me for a long, still moment. Then something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not warmth, exactly. Not yet, something more like the earliest movement of recognition. Sit down, Miss Calloway, he said. I hadn't told him my name. My blood ran cold and warm at once, fear and something more dangerous curling together like smoke. He knew my name. He'd had me investigated before I'd even walked through the door, and still, God help me, I pulled out the chair and sat down. He knew my name. He knew my name, which meant he knew other things too. I sat across from Lazaro Voss in that softly lit private suite and kept my hands folded in my lap with the kind of deliberate calm that is really just terror wearing a professional face. I was a waitress. I had a notepad in my apron pocket. I had rent due in 11 days and a mother who needed her medication refilled and a history degree I'd never finished. I was not equipped for whatever this was. You're uncomfortable, he said. It didn't carry sympathy, it was an observation, clinical, precise. He tilted his head slightly, watching me the way a chess player watches the board. "You had me looked into before I walked in," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. That's worth being uncomfortable about. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, maybe, a slight adjustment at the corners of his mouth that his eyes didn't follow. "Standard practice," he said. "For waitresses? For people who see things they aren't meant to see." I held his gaze. "You mean last night?" "I mean last night." He leaned back, and the gesture was fluid, unhurried, the posture of a man who'd long ago made peace with taking up space. "I want to understand your intentions." My intentions were to refill water glasses and go home. And instead? I looked at him for a moment. Instead, I saw someone who looked like they needed a hand. The suite was quiet enough that I could hear the subtle shift in his breathing. Not like last night, not the ragged, fractured breathing of someone losing their grip. Something more controlled. Deliberate, but different from a moment ago. "That's it?" he said. "No angle, no phone recording, no plan to." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite casual. "Leverage what you witnessed." "Leverage," I repeated slowly. "You think I held your hand as an investment? Most people would." "I'm not most people," I said. Then, before I could stop myself, and for what it's worth, whatever happened last night, it doesn't define you in my head. People fall apart sometimes. It doesn't make them lesser. The silence that followed was absolute. Lazaro Voss looked at me with an expression I couldn't catalog, something between suspicion and something more fragile, something he was clearly working very hard to keep behind glass. "You're not afraid of me," he said. Not a compliment. An assessment. "I didn't say that," I answered honestly. "I said it doesn't make you lesser." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached forward and turned his water glass once, precisely the way someone does when their hands need something to do. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not the file. The file is facts. Tell me something true." I blinked. Of all the directions this conversation might have gone, this was not one I'd mapped. Why? "Because you held my hand in the dark without asking anything for it," he said, "and I want to know what kind of person does that." I told him about my mother. I don't know why. I hadn't planned to. But there was something about the way he asked, direct, with none of the performative concern people usually layer over questions like that made me answer the same way. I told him she'd been diagnosed with early onset MS 3 years ago, that I'd been in my second year of law school when the medical bills started arriving in quantities that rewrote the math of my entire future, that I'd deferred my enrollment with the intention of returning, and that deferral had quietly become permanent when reality proved itself less flexible than I'd planned. I told him I didn't regret it. Not exactly. He listened without interrupting, which surprised me. Men like him, powerful men accustomed to rooms bending around their presence, rarely listened. They waited for their turn to speak. Lazaro Voss listened. "You gave up a future you'd built to stay," he said when I finished. "She's my mother. Most people would have found a compromise. Most people haven't watched someone they love lose the use of their hands and still insist on making their own coffee," I said. "She earned the right to have someone show up for her." Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, this wasn't a man given to dramatic expressions, but something quieted in him, some constant low-level tension I hadn't even identified until I noticed it easing. "Your father?" he asked. "Gone when I was 9. I kept my voice level. Yours?" His jaw tightened. "Don't." "Fair enough," I said. We looked at each other across the empty table. "Why did you come back?" I asked. "You could have had me removed from the roster. You could have ensured we never crossed paths again." He considered the question with the seriousness of someone who'd already turned it over many times. "I wanted to see if you'd changed," he said quietly. "If you'd look at me differently today." "And?" "You sat down across from me like I was a person," he said. Not an empire. The way he said it, low, almost reluctant, like the admission cost him something he'd been carrying for a long time, cracked something open in the room. I felt it. The atmosphere shifted the way it does before thunder, charged and still and promising something you weren't sure you were ready for. He stood then, unhurriedly, buttoning his jacket. Professional armor back in place. "I'll be returning Friday," he said. Same suite. He was already moving toward the door when I found my voice. "I don't understand what this is," I said. He paused with his hand on the doorframe, didn't turn around. "Neither do I," he said. "That's why I'm coming back." He walked out and left me sitting alone in a room that still held the shape of his presence. My heart was doing something reckless and inadvisable, and I was already counting the days until Friday. By Wednesday, I'd Googled him properly. Not the business section article. Not the corporate biography on the Voss Capital website, which was all marble columns and language so sanitized it told you absolutely nothing. The other articles. The ones buried 4 or 5 pages deep in search results, where the headlines got sharper. Voss Syndicate linked to Northern Harbor disappearances. 3 witnesses recant. Federal probe into Voss Capital Holdings yields no charges, 5th year running. Body found in Cortez River identified AS former Voss associate. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and the overhead light, humming its familiar, unremarkable hum, and I read until the words started blurring. Lazaro Voss was 34 years old. He'd taken control of the Voss Syndicate at 23 when his father, Edvard Voss, died under circumstances that 3 separate investigations had ruled inconclusive. He had a law degree from Castellan University that he'd apparently never needed, a property portfolio spanning 4 countries, and a reputation for running the most efficient and mercilessly quiet criminal operation the city had seen in 40 years. Efficient and quiet. 2 words that, in this context, meant people didn't talk, because people who talked ended up in the Cortez River. I shut the laptop. I sat in my quiet kitchen, listening to my mother shift in her sleep in the next room, and I thought about a man on a marble floor with a trembling hand. I thought about the way he'd said "neither do I like" it was the most honest thing he'd permitted himself to say in years. I should have called Marcus and asked to be permanently reassigned. I didn't. Thursday passed without incident. Friday arrived, and I told myself I was walking into Suite 4 because it was my job and Marcus had assigned it, and I was a professional who had bills to pay. I believed approximately 40% of this as I pushed open the door at exactly 7 in the evening. He was already there, as he'd been last time. This time, there was a second glass on the table. He'd ordered for me. Not food, he couldn't have known what I'd want, but a particular wine I recognized from the list, a soft Barolo that cost 3 times my hourly rate. "You're making assumptions," I said, setting down my notepad. "I'm making an invitation," he said. "Sit, I'm working." "Consider this part of your work," I sat, because arguing about it would have cost more energy than conceding, and also because some traitorous part of me had been looking forward to this since Tuesday and didn't care about pretending otherwise. "I want to talk about Cortez River," I said. He went very still. "That's direct," he said after a beat. "You said you wanted something true. I'd like the same courtesy." Lazaro reached forward and lifted his wine glass with the unhurried precision of someone who did not rattle easily. He took a slow sip, set it down, looked at me. "What exactly would you like to know?" he asked. His voice was completely neutral, the stillness of deep water. "The man they found in the river. Peter Andes. He was your associate." "He was an employee," Lazaro said, briefly. "He was found with a broken sternum and no wallet. People are mugged in this city every day, Miss Calloway. People with bodyguards and panic buttons aren't usually mugged," I said. "People who've just testified or almost testified are different." The suite hummed quietly around us. Somewhere in the main dining room, a woman laughed, and the sound was so ordinary it felt almost surreal. Lazaro looked at me for a long moment. Something behind his eyes moved, not guilt, I didn't think. Something more complex than guilt. the look of a man who'd made decisions so far above the law's reach that guilt had become an abstract concept, but who still carried the weight of those decisions in some deep interior way. "You're afraid of me now," he said. "I can see it. I'm afraid for myself," I said, which was more honest. "There's a difference." "Yes," he said softly. "There is." "Tell me something true," I said, his own words back to him. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Peter Andaz was going to hand documents to the federal attorney that would have resulted in the imprisonment of 7 people, he said finally, his voice very low. 3 of them were innocent of the specific charges. 2 of them were children of men who work for me and who have families they've kept completely clean. A pause. "I don't expect you to find that acceptable." "I don't," I said. "I know." He looked at the wine glass. "That's also why I keep coming back." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "that I have spent 11 years surrounded by people who find everything I do acceptable. People who nod and agree and make it very easy to forget that there's another way to exist." He looked up at me. "You don't nod." The air between us had changed. I felt it the same way I'd felt the shift in the corridor on that first night, a pressure, like the moment before lightning makes its decision. It was at that exact moment that the door to the suite opened. Not gently, not with the deferential knock of restaurant staff. A man stepped in, broad, dressed in black, eyes scanning the room with the trained automatic sweep of security. He crossed to Lazaro without acknowledging me and bent to speak quietly at his ear. Whatever he said made Lazaro's entire face change, not to fear, to something colder and more absolute. He rose from the table with the contained precision of a man who'd shifted instantaneously from one version of himself to another. "You need to go home," he said to me, his voice stripped of everything warm. "Now, don't take the bus tonight, I'll have a car. What's happening?" I said. "Go home, Sarah." It was the first time he'd used my first name. I went home. I took the car he sent, black, anonymous, driven by a man who said nothing. And at 11:40 that night, I watched from my apartment window as 2 black SUVs rolled slowly down my street, headlights dark, and stopped outside my building for exactly 90 seconds before driving away. He called on Saturday morning. I didn't have his number. It appeared on my phone as unknown, the way powerful men's numbers always do, as if their identities are options rather than facts. "The men outside your building last night were mine," he said, before I could speak. "Watching. Not a threat. Watching for what?" A pause. "There's a rival family, the Renardi Group, that has been observing my recent movements, including the Velvet Room." My kitchen felt very small suddenly. My mother's medication sat on the counter in a neat orange row. My half-drunk coffee had gone cold. "They saw me," I said. "It wasn't a question. They photographed you entering and leaving my suite." His voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "I am managing the situation." "Managing," I repeated. "That's a word that covers a lot of territory, Sarah." Low. Direct. My name again, and somehow no less startling than the first time. "I need you to trust me for the next 72 hours. You need me to trust the man who just told me a criminal organization has photographs of me." Yes. A beat. "I know that's unreasonable. It's insane," I said. "It's completely insane, yes," he said again. There was something in that single syllable, an acknowledgement, not an apology, from a man who apparently couldn't offer apologies but could offer honesty instead. I pressed my hand flat on the kitchen counter, breathed. "What do I do?" I asked. The exhale I heard on the other end of the line was quiet, barely audible, but I heard it. "Don't go into work today," he said. "I'll handle the Velvet Room. Stay in your apartment. Lock the deadbolt, not just the chain." And a fractional pause. "Answer if I call." "Fine," I said. "Fine," he echoed. And then, before the line went dead, "You're not what I expected." I stood in my kitchen for a long time after he hung up, replaying those 5 words. "You're not what I expected." Coming from a man who had apparently expected enough betrayal and manipulation from the world to build an entire empire around anticipating it, I understood that wasn't a compliment. It was something heavier. Something that had cost him something to say. Reef third-person POV. Lazaro. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse and watched the city the way he always did, as a map of threats and resources, distances and timelines. The Renardi photographs were on his desk. 4 images. The waitress Sarah entering the East Corridor, the waitress emerging, her profile against the exit light, her name and address which the Renardi group had assembled with unacceptable efficiency. Dorian Voss, his younger brother, and the syndicate's chief strategist leaned in the doorway with the easy posture of a man who hadn't yet learned that doors were for knocking. "She's a civilian," Dorian said. "Cut her loose before this escalates." "I know what she is." "Then you know she's a liability." Lazaro turned from the window. He looked at his brother with the particular quality of attention that had, historically, ended arguments before they fully began. "She held my hand in the dark," he said quietly, "and asked for nothing." Dorian was silent. "Nobody has done that," Lazaro said. "In 11 years. Nobody." He turned back to the window. Below, the city moved in its uncaring, perpetual way, traffic and light and the small private catastrophes of a million ordinary lives. She can't become part of this world, he thought. Then, almost immediately, she already has. He arrived at my apartment at 7 that evening. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected the phone calls, the perimeter of silent black cars, the second-hand information filtered through a man who maintained control by managing distance. I did not expect him to knock on my actual door. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, more human-looking than I'd seen him. The penthouse armor was slightly relaxed, the top button of his shirt undone, the jacket hanging open, his hands in his pockets. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "I know." He looked past me into the apartment with a gaze that processed quickly, automatically, exits, angles, vulnerabilities. "Can I come in?" I stepped back. He moved through my small apartment carefully, like a man accustomed to vast spaces who was making himself smaller without making it visible. He noticed the medication on the counter, the law textbook I still hadn't returned to the university library, the photograph of my mother from before she got sick, pinned above the kitchen window where I could see it from the sink. He stood looking at that photograph for a moment. "She's beautiful," he said. "She still is," I said. He turned, and the expression on his face was the one I'd been cataloging since the corridor, the one that appeared in unguarded moments that had no armor over it. An old grief, private and carefully maintained. "My mother died when I was 15, he said. I didn't have a photograph. The admission sat between us. I didn't respond to it with sympathy. I'd already learned that sympathy made him retreat. I just let it be there, present and acknowledged. "The Renardi situation," I said. "Tell me how bad it actually is." He crossed his arms, looked at the floor for a beat. "They want leverage over me. You've become a potential leverage point because you came back," I said quietly. "Because you requested me by name." His jaw tightened. "Yes," I breathed through that. "So you put me in danger by being human for 10 minutes in a corridor?" "Yes, no evasion, no softening. And I'm sorry." I looked at him. Lazaro Voss had just apologized. He looked vaguely surprised at himself, too. And then, in the particular silence that followed an unexpected honesty, he stepped closer, not much, just enough to change the quality of the air between us, and I forgot, briefly, how to think in complete sentences. His hand came up slowly, not reaching, not demanding, and brushed a strand of hair from my face with 2 fingers. The touch lasted less than a second, and my entire nervous system rewrote itself around that single, unbearable moment. 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended tension, like weather that kept threatening rain and never delivered. The Renardi surveillance, Lazaro told me, had been addressed. I didn't ask what that meant. I was learning, slowly and against every instinct I'd developed in a life built on asking questions and pressing for answers, that there were words in his world that functioned as containers for things I wasn't ready to hold. I kept going to work. He kept reserving Suite 4 on Fridays. We settled into something that had no name, dinner that was officially business and actually the most honest conversation I'd had with another person in years. He asked about my mother. I asked about the Port District expansion, about the legal architecture of his holdings, about whether he'd ever considered the actual humans affected by his decisions. He answered some things, deflected others, never lied as far as I could tell, and I was a woman who'd read enough legal texts to know the difference between a lie and a strategic omission. I told myself it was just conversation. I told myself his hand brushing my hair had been incidental. I was a very convincing liar when I needed to be. The truth was that every Friday I dressed for the Velvet Room with a particular care that I recognized and refused to examine. The truth was that I'd started listening to that low, aching jazz on my phone during my commute. The truth was that I thought about him in the empty spaces of ordinary days, on the bus, in the pharmacy, stirring soup at the stove, and each time I caught myself doing it, I catalogued it as a problem and filed it under Do Not Act On. It was Delphine who warned me. On a Tuesday afternoon in the break room, Delphine was tall, perpetually immaculate, and possessed of the specific social intelligence of someone who'd worked in luxury hospitality long enough to know where all the bodies were buried, sometimes quite literally. The Voss account, she said, not looking up from her phone. "You're being careful. I'm his assigned server," I said. "You're having dinner with him." She looked up. Her expression was not unkind. It was clear-eyed, the way a doctor's is when they're about to tell you something you've already suspected. "I've worked this floor for 6 years, Sarah. Men like Voss don't have dinner with waitresses. He asks questions. I answer. It's not," she said simply. "I don't know what it is, but it's not nothing." She paused. His last, whatever you'd call it, the woman before. A lawyer named Celeste Marin. She disappeared from his world as suddenly as she'd entered it. No explanation. No goodbye. She moved to another city within a month. I kept my face neutral. People move. People move when they're afraid, Delphine said, or when someone with considerable influence suggests the relocation. She picked up her coffee. "I like you, Sarah. That's the whole reason I'm saying this. Be careful what you build in places you can't afford to lose." I thought about Celeste Marin all evening. He didn't mention her Friday. He didn't mention anyone from his private life. That was one of the consistent geometries of our dinners, I'd noticed. He asked. I answered. He offered carefully selected disclosures about himself, like a man distributing resources from a finite supply. His past was a country he visited in fragments, but that evening something was different. He arrived late, 12 minutes, which for a man whose life ran on precision was the equivalent of a different person arriving disheveled. He sat down and poured his own water, which he'd never done before. "You're distracted," I said. "I'm thinking." "About?" He looked at the table. "My brother believes I've made a mistake." "In what regard?" "In this regard." He gestured briefly between us. The gesture was small, economical, the way he was with most things, but it carried an enormous weight. I sat with that for a moment. "And you?" I asked. He looked up at me with those dark, still eyes. I think mistakes and choices can look identical from the outside. What's the difference from the inside? A long pause, whether you'd do it again knowing the outcome. "And would you?" I asked. "Come back, ask for me." "All of it." He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. The word landed in my chest like a stone into still water. Then he opened the inside pocket of his jacket and set a small, sealed envelope on the table in front of me. "Before you respond to that," he said, "open this." I looked at it. White envelope, no markings. I picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page. I opened it. It was a letter. Miss Calloway. "You will find, upon investigation, that a sum has been deposited into your mother's medical account sufficient to cover 18 months of ongoing treatment costs. This is not a gift with conditions. It is not leverage. I am aware of how those words sound coming from me, and I accept that you have every reason to disbelieve them. I ask only that you believe this. It was the single thing I could do that was entirely for someone else and not for myself. Your mother should have her treatment. That's all. It has nothing to do with Friday evenings. LV." I set the letter down. My hands, I noticed distantly, were not quite steady. "Lazaro," I said. "Don't," he shook his head slightly, "don't thank me. And don't, a fractional pause. Don't tell me it changes nothing. I know it changes things. I'm not asking for what it changes. I just needed to do something that was..." He stopped. "Human?" I said softly. He looked at me. "Clean," he said. "Something clean." I stared at that letter for a long time, and somewhere behind the warmth and the terror and the specific, beautiful horror of being seen like this, I felt the first whisper of a thought I wasn't ready for, that I might be falling for a man I could not save and could not resist and could not survive. The medical payment hit my mother's account on Monday. $41,700. Not a round number. The specific, surgical precision of a man who'd had someone look up the actual outstanding balance and match it exactly. Not more, not less. That's all. The phrase from his letter kept circling in me. Something clean. I sat with my phone in my hands in the hospital corridor while my mother had her Tuesday appointment, and I thought about all the things I'd been trained, by every reasonable instinct I possessed, to think about a moment like this. This is how it begins. Generosity as architecture. Build enough debt, enough gratitude, enough dependency, and suddenly the person who can't leave isn't choosing to stay. They're trapped in a beautifully constructed cage made of things they needed. I knew this. I believed this. And yet I also believed, with a certainty I couldn't entirely explain, that the letter was exactly what it claimed to be. Not a strategy. A compulsion. The act of a man who'd spent so long operating in the transactional language of power that doing something unmotivated by self-interest had been, for him, a kind of relief. My mother emerged from the appointment looking tired but lighter than she had in months. The new treatment plan was working. Her hands were steadier. "You look worried," she said, reading me with the infuriating accuracy of mothers everywhere. "I'm fine," I said. She took my hand. Her grip was still strong when she concentrated. "Is there someone?" I opened my mouth to deny it. "There's someone," she said. The confrontation came the following Friday, but not from the direction I'd been watching. It came from Dorian Voss. I was arriving for my shift, early, 7:15, through the staff entrance, when a car pulled alongside me on the narrow service road. Black, expensive, and stopped with a precision that made it clear it wasn't accidental. The window came down. Dorian Voss was younger than his brother by 5 or 6 years, less architecturally severe, with an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind of handsome that immediately made you cautious. "Miss Calloway," he said. "A word." "I'm late for work," I said. "You're 12 minutes early." He smiled. I checked. He tilted his head at the seat beside him. "Just a conversation. I'll have you inside in 5 minutes." Every instinct I had said no. But something else, the lawyer in me that had never entirely gone to sleep, said that refusing Dorian Voss was a statement, and I wasn't ready to make it yet. I got in the car. He drove half a block, stopped again. The driver sat with inhuman stillness in the front. "You're good for him," Dorian said. "I want to say that first, because what comes after might not sound like it." "Go ahead," I said. "There's a situation developing that Lazaro hasn't told you about. He kept his tone light, conversational. The Renardi Group's interest in you isn't neutralized. It's evolved. They're planning to use you as a pressure point, not a threat, but a public exposure. They have evidence, or what they're calling evidence, that my brother's relationship with you constitutes a personal vulnerability they can exploit in the court of public opinion. He paused. The federal attorney has been approached. The car felt smaller. That would mean, I started, that a civilian woman with no connection to our organization becomes part of a federal narrative, he said. Your name, your photograph, your mother's medical payment. He looked at me, which, I'll be honest with you, looks very different in a federal filing than it did when Lazaro meant it. I understood. I understood with a horrible clarity. The $41,000, unmotivated by strategy, clean, human, could be documented as payment, as influence, as the first installment of an arrangement. The story writes itself in the worst possible terms, and I had no defense against it, because I had no context that would make sense outside of private Friday dinners that no court would understand. What does he know? I asked. Dorian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something respectful in it. He knows the Renardi filing is being prepared. He doesn't know they have the payment documented already. A pause. I'm telling you first because I want to see what you do with it. You're testing me, I said flatly. I'm evaluating you, he corrected. There's a difference. Lazaro doesn't test people he cares about. He trusts them completely, which is a beautiful quality that has historically been catastrophic. He studied me. He told you about our mother. I went still. I can see it, Dorian said. He hasn't spoken about her to anyone in years, not even me. His tone changed, still controlled, but something genuinely complicated in it. Whatever you are to him, you need to decide right now whether you're going to use this information to protect yourself by distancing yourself, or whether you're going to walk into that restaurant tonight and sit across from a man who is about to be blindsided by something that might cost him more. I looked at the staff entrance of the Velvet Room, visible through the car window. Is it a test if there's only one right answer? I asked. Dorian studied me for a long moment. Then he reached across and opened my door. Go in, he said. Tell him what I've told you. Don't protect yourself by softening it. A pause. And Miss Calloway, if you hurt him, we'll be having a very different conversation. I got out. I walked to the entrance. My hands were steady. My heart was not. Lazaro was already in Suite 4 when I walked in. He looked up, and something in my face told him immediately. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. The shift was barely visible and absolute. What happened? He said. Your brother talked to me, I said. Lazaro, the Renardi Group has the payment documented. They're going federal. And for one unguarded moment, I watched a man who controlled an empire look like he'd been struck. What happened next happened fast. Lazaro was on his phone before I'd finished the sentence, not panicked, nothing so human as that, but moving with the kind of contained, lethal efficiency I'd only read about in those buried search results. A switch thrown. An entirely different version of him activated. He spoke in low, rapid Italian to someone on the other end, paced to the window, turned back, gave instructions in English, switched again. I sat at the dinner table and watched a man become a general. I won't pretend I wasn't frightened. There was a particular quality to his authority in those minutes, the absolute zero of it, the sense that every word he spoke was simultaneously an order and a verdict. 2 of his men arrived within 4 minutes, entering through the suite's private door with the muted, purposeful energy of people who'd been ready before they were called. When he ended the last call, the room was very quiet. He stood with his phone at his side and his back to me, looking at the window. His reflection looked back from the dark glass, composed, precise, utterly controlled. Then he turned. "Are you all right?" he said, of all the things he might have said. "I'm fine," I said. "Are you?" Something in his expression compressed, then released. He crossed the room and sat across from me, not in the posture of the general he'd been 60 seconds ago, but in the posture I knew better, the one that only appeared in private. "The payment," he said. I didn't consider how it could look. "I know. I would never use it as—" "I know," I said again. He looked at me. "You believe me?" "Yes," I said, without reservation. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, and I could see the absolute stillness he enforced on them, the deliberate version of the stillness he'd built since that night on the corridor floor. "The Renardi filing will claim you're an associate," he said. "They'll claim the payment was a retainer for services rendered, and that you've been providing information about your other patrons at the restaurant." His voice was carefully even. "It's constructed. It's also going to be very difficult to disprove quickly. I haven't provided information to anyone," I said. "I know. My name will be in a federal filing. Yes." He met my gaze. "I am going to do everything in my power to prevent that from becoming a permanent record. But I need to be honest with you, I can't guarantee the timeline." The room hummed its quiet hum. Somewhere, the jazz played. "You need to stay somewhere else for a while," he said. "Your apartment is—" "No," I said. He paused. "Sarah, my mother's medications need refrigeration and a consistent schedule. I can't simply— I have a property," he said carefully, "in the North Residential District. It's secure. Your mother would have nursing care, every resource. You want me to move into one of your houses?" I said slowly. "I want you to be safe and have every possible appearance of being exactly what the Renardi filing says I am." He went very still. "You've thought about it," I said. "I've thought about nothing else for 4 minutes," he admitted, with the directness that I'd come to recognize as his version of complete honesty. "Lazaro," I said, "putting me inside your property doesn't protect me. It puts a frame around me." I leaned forward slightly. "I need to be able to say truthfully to anyone who asks that I am a waitress, that I have a personal relationship with you that does not constitute an association, and that the payment was—" I stopped. "What?" he said. I thought about what it could be called. What frame could be put around $41,000 that rendered it clean in the language of federal documentation? "Tell me it was an anonymous medical grant," I said, "distributed through a charitable foundation." He looked at me with sharpening attention. "Voss Capital has a charitable foundation," I said. I looked it up. It distributes medical grants to families below a certain income threshold. My mother qualifies. If the payment can be documented as originating from the foundation rather than from you personally, it would take 24 hours to restructure the paper trail, he said. He was already thinking it through. I could see it. Dorian could. Can you trust Dorian? A pause. With this? Yes. Then call him. I held his gaze. Tonight, before the federal filing is completed. He looked at me for a long moment. Then one corner of his mouth moved, just barely, just the ghost of something that under different circumstances might have been a smile. "You said you left law school," he said. "I did." That, he said quietly, was the law school's loss. He reached for his phone. Then he stopped. "The confrontation tonight," he said. "In the Harbor District. I have to be there." My chest tightened. "What kind of confrontation?" "The Renardi Group has a warehouse contact who will be receiving documentation tonight. I need to intercept that." I understood what intercept meant. I looked at him, this man who could apologize and mean it, who left no photograph of his dead mother because there had been no one to take one, who sat on marble floors and trembled and then rebuilt himself into something the world could not dent, and I felt the terror of caring about someone, who lived inside violence the way most people lived inside houses. "Come back," I said. He looked at me. Something raw moved through his expression. "Sarah, I'm not asking you not to go," I said. "I know I can't do that. I'm asking you to come back." He stood, buttoned his jacket. The general was back, but underneath it, I could see the man. "I'll come back," he said quietly. He left. I sat alone in Suite 4 with the untouched wine and the jazz and the particular suffocating feeling of waiting for someone to come home from somewhere you can't follow, and I realized, sitting in that gilded room, that I had already made my choice, even though I'd been telling myself for weeks that I was still deciding. He came back at 2 in the morning. Not to the restaurant, to my apartment. I'd been awake, I hadn't seriously attempted sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with my dead phone plugged in, and my mother asleep and the dead bolt thrown the way he'd told me weeks ago. 3 months of ordinary life had layered itself over that instruction until it had just become habit. Now it felt like it meant something again. The knock was quiet. 3 times. Deliberate. I knew it was him before I opened the door, and I knew from the first sight of him that it had not been clean. He was unhurt. I checked for that first, automatically, in a way that told me more about where I'd arrived emotionally than I was ready to acknowledge. No visible wounds. But his jacket was gone, his shirt had been changed, different shirt, wrong shade of white, too large, and there was a quality to his stillness that was different from his usual contained authority. Something held together by concentration rather than ease. "Come in," I said. He came in. He stood in the middle of my small kitchen and looked around it the way he'd looked the first time he was here, processing, cataloging, but slower now, like a man who needed the ordinary to anchor him. I didn't ask questions. I put the kettle on. He sat at my kitchen table, which was slightly too small for him, and put his hands flat on the surface the way he had on the marble floor that first night. That same grounding gesture. I set tea in front of him when it was ready. He looked at it for a moment, then wrapped his hands around the mug with something almost like gratitude. "The documentation was intercepted," he said, finally. "Good." There was a complication. A long pause. One of the Renardi men, he wasn't supposed to be there. He was. He stopped. I waited. 17, Lazaro said. The kitchen was very quiet. "He was alive when my men left," he said quickly. "Injured. He'll recover." He was looking at the tea. "But he was 17 years old and scared, and I—" He stopped again. The sentence had nowhere to go that wouldn't cost him something he'd been protecting. "You couldn't do it," I said softly. He looked up sharply. "The cold thing," I said. "Whatever the cold version of you would have done. You couldn't do it." He was very still. "It compromised the operation, I know. That's not," he exhaled. "That's not a thing I can afford. Not in this world. Dorian is going to tell me it was weak. That it creates exposure. That." "Lazaro," I said. He stopped. I looked at him across my small kitchen table with its chipped corner and its photograph of my mother above the window. It wasn't weak. He looked at me like a man hearing something spoken in a language he'd convinced himself he'd forgotten. "You keep doing that," he said, very quietly. "What?" "Saying the thing that I need." The words were careful, like each one cost something. Not the thing that flatters, not the thing that manages me. The thing that is, he paused. The thing that is true. The space between us had changed again. It kept doing that, finding new dimensions I hadn't known existed, deeper and more freighted with each conversation. He reached across the table, not quickly, not with any demand in it, just his hand, open on the table between us, the same way I'd offered mine to him in the corridor. I looked at it for one long moment. Then I placed my hand in his. This time, neither of us was trembling. This time, it was entirely different. Not comfort given and received, but something mutual, something equal. 2 people choosing the same thing at the same time without pretending it was less than it was. He looked at our joined hands. Then, up at me. "I can't promise you safety," he said. "I can't promise you ordinary. I can't promise you a future that looks like the ones you were supposed to have." He was looking at me with an honesty so unfiltered it was almost painful to receive. "I can promise you that I have never in my adult life told a single person the truth about myself the way I have told you. And that, whatever you decide to do with that, I am aware that it means something." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. "I'm not afraid of your world," I said. "I'm afraid of what it costs people, I know. I don't want you to change everything about who you are," I said slowly. "I'm not asking for that. But I need to know that the 17-year-old version of tonight, that the thing that stopped you, that's real. That it's not an anomaly. It's you," he said simply. "You're making me remember what it felt like before I decided not to." I leaned forward across the small, chipped, perfectly ordinary table, and I kissed him. It was not the kisses of stories, not crashing or overwhelming. It was quiet and deliberate and entirely intentional, and he received it the way he'd received my honesty all along, completely, without deflection, with his whole self present. When I pulled back, his eyes were open, and in them, unguarded, undisguised, impossible to explain away, was something that looked remarkably like wonder. "Sarah," he said, very quietly. Her name in his mouth like something he was learning to say properly. "I know," I said. "I know what this is. I know what it costs." I looked at him steadily. "I'm staying anyway." Something in his face changed, something foundational, the way a building's whole structure shifts when a load-bearing wall decides, after years of careful maintenance, that it can finally rest. He stayed until 4 in the morning, and we talked until the city began to lighten outside my window. He told me about his father. I told him about law school. He fell asleep in my kitchen chair with his head tipped back and his hands loose on the table, and I sat across from him and thought, "This is the most dangerous thing you have ever done." And also, I would do it again tomorrow. They came for us on a Tuesday. Not the Renardis, the threat I'd been watching. Something older, closer, and far more surgical. It was Dorian. I found out from a phone call I wasn't supposed to receive, a misdial, a fractured 30-second conversation between two voices I barely recognized. One of them saying she's the problem, she makes him soft, the Renardi deal falls apart because of her, we move by Thursday. And then silence. And a deadline, and me standing in the Velvet Room's break room with my phone in my hand, and a feeling like the ground had become theoretical. Dorian Voss, who had warned me, who had looked me in the eyes and said, "Tell him what I told you, don't soften it." Who had, I understood now with horrible clarity, been evaluating me not to protect his brother but to determine exactly what kind of leverage I represented. I called Lazaro. He answered on the first ring. "Listen to me," I said, and something in my voice must have been different because he said nothing, just listened. I told him what I'd heard, every word. I didn't soften it, and I didn't protect myself, and I didn't protect Dorian, because there was no version of protecting Dorian that didn't cost Lazaro something he couldn't afford. The silence on the other end of the line was the most frightening thing I'd ever heard from him. "Where are you?" he said. "The Velvet Room. Don't move," he said. "Don't go outside. I'm coming." He came in 11 minutes. I know because I counted. What happened between Lazaro and Dorian, I only know in fragments, because he told me what he could and protected me from the rest, and I let him, because some truths are jagged enough that a full account of them does more damage than the edit. What I know, Dorian had been working with the Renardi group for 4 months, not selling his brother out, not entirely, not yet, but positioning, keeping options open, building a parallel arrangement that would maintain the Voss Empire's interests even if Lazaro's increasing humanity, as Dorian apparently put it, began to compromise operations. What I know, Lazaro confronted him in the Voss penthouse, with 3 senior syndicate men present as witnesses. The confrontation lasted 40 minutes. Dorian was removed from his position within the organization. He was not hurt. He was not, in the language of their world, handled. He was sent away. I know this cost Lazaro something that had no currency. He came to me afterward, not as the general. Not even as the cautious, careful version of himself he'd been in those early Friday dinners. He came as the man on the marble floor, undone, briefly, genuinely, in the particular way that betrayal from someone you love undoes a person. He sat on the edge of my couch and I sat beside him, and for a long time neither of us said anything. I grew up protecting him, Lazaro said eventually. His voice was quiet and very rough. When my father was, he stopped. Tried again. When things were bad in the house, I put myself between them. Every time. A pause. He was my reason for building all of this, so he'd never have to be afraid again. I didn't say I'm sorry. I didn't say he betrayed you. I said, he's afraid now. That's still your brother. He looked at me. It doesn't mean you trust him, I said. It doesn't mean he didn't do what he did. But the version of him that remembered what fear felt like, that's still in there. You didn't lose him. You just can't keep him in the same room as your empire. Lazaro looked at the middle distance for a long time. Then he exhaled, long, slow, something releasing from the deep architecture of him. What do I do with you, he said. Not a question, a genuine, bewildered, nearly tender observation. Keep me, I said. He turned. In the low light of my apartment, with the city doing its uncaring glittering outside the window, Lazaro Voss looked at me with the fullness of everything he was. The ruthlessness and the grief, the power and the panic attack on the cold floor, the general and the boy who'd stood between his. Little brother and a violent father, all of it present, all of it undisguised. He kissed me. This time not quiet and deliberate, but with everything. With the months of careful restraint released into something urgent and deep and unperformable. A kiss that had no strategy in it at all. When we finally pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to mine. I have to clean this up, he said quietly. The Renardi deal. The federal filing. Dorian's arrangements. All of it. A pause. It's going to be months. It's going to be difficult. I know, I said. You don't have to stay for that. You said that once before, I said. I stayed then too. He pulled back just far enough to look at me. Something in him had changed permanently, I could see it. A door that had been held closed for years now standing open, not because he'd been forced, but because he'd chosen to leave it that way. I want you to finish law school, he said. I'll fund whatever you need. No strings. No conditions. Your mother's care is covered regardless of. Lazaro, I said. Stop trying to give me an exit strategy. His mouth curved, slowly, fully, a real smile, rare as honest weather in this city. Old habit, he said. Break it, I said. He laughed, not a polished or controlled sound, a real one, low and rough and surprised, the laugh of a man who'd forgotten the mechanics and was relearning them in real time. I held on to that sound, filed it away. Pressed it into the part of me that was already beginning to understand that this, all of this, the darkness and the jazz and the marble floors and the terror and the warmth, was home now. My particular, complicated, undeniable home.
Eve, third person. Lazaro. Final.
He watched her from the doorway of the kitchen as she made tea for the second time that night, moving with her ordinary, unhurried grace, her hair loose, her feet bare on the floor that was not his, and somehow felt more like solid ground than any room he'd stood in for 20 years. She knows what you are, he thought. All of it. And she's making tea. For a man who had built his entire existence on the premise that intimacy was leverage and trust was optimism, this moment, this woman, this kitchen, this unbearable ordinary, was the most revolutionary thing he'd ever encountered. He was going to protect it, whatever it cost. Whatever it cost. 3 months later, the federal filing was quietly closed. The Voss Charitable Foundation documentation held. The Renardi Group's key witness declined to continue cooperation under circumstances that remained officially unexplained. The case against Lazzaro collapsed the way such cases in this city had always collapsed, not with a verdict, but with a careful, institutional silence. I went back to law school, not full-time. I negotiated a part-time enrollment, evenings and online modules structured around my mother's care schedule and my reduced hours at the Velvet Room. It was slower than I'd planned, all those years ago when I'd imagined my future as a straight and manageable road. But slower wasn't the same as stopped. I'd learned that. I'd learned a lot of things about the difference between delay and surrender. My mother improved. The new treatment continued to work in small, incremental ways, her hands steadier, her days longer, her laughter more frequent. She met Lazzaro in February. He shook her hand with precise courtesy and asked her about her garden, which she'd mentioned having once, and listened to her describe it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Complete, unhurried, entirely present. Afterward, she looked at me with the expression I'd learned to read as I have feelings about this, and said only, "He's more frightened of me than he was of anything you've described. He's frightened of things that matter to him," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "You've grown up very fast this year, or woken up," I said. "I'm not sure which." She took my hand. "Both," she said. "Both. Lazzaro and I don't live in the same house. Not yet. He has the penthouse, the empire, the geography of a life built on power and beautiful, dangerous necessity. I have my apartment, my books, my mother's medication in its neat orange row. There are things between us that I cannot change, and some I've stopped trying to. There are nights he comes home late from places I don't ask about and sits in my kitchen and holds his tea until the tension in his shoulders releases. There are mornings I wake up and find him already awake, standing at my window watching the city with the particular stillness of a man cataloging a world that might, at any moment, require managing. I don't pretend his world is clean. I don't pretend I've fixed him, or saved him, or transformed him into someone ordinary. He's the same man who built an empire on fear and precision and the weaponization of silence. He's also the man who didn't hurt a 17-year-old boy, who sent an exact payment to a woman's medical account because he wanted to do something clean, who sat on a marble floor with a stranger's hand in his and came back the next day to find out what kind of person reaches out in the dark without asking for anything in return. Both of those are true. Both of those are him, and I am the woman who chose to know that completely and stay anyway. Not because love made me reckless, but because after 26 years of being a person who managed everything carefully, who gave up futures and built contingencies and deferred her own needs in favor of what was required of her, I finally found something that felt like choosing rather than surviving. This is not a safe story. It doesn't have clean edges. But then, the most honest things rarely do. The jazz plays on Friday evenings in Suite 4, the chandeliers drip their frozen waterfall light, and somewhere in the East Corridor, if you press your back to the cold marble wall and close your eyes, you can almost feel the ghost of a moment where an ordinary woman sat down beside a powerful man, held out her hand, and changed the entire direction of two lives with nothing but the willingness to stay. That was enough. That was everything.